Carol Jensen's hands moved with practiced ease across the spinning pottery wheel, her fingers gently shaping the wet clay into a smooth, elegant vase. At 67 years old, her hands still possessed the steady control that had defined her entire life, though now they created beauty instead of what they used to create. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of her small ceramic studio on Main Street in Willow Creek. It had been raining for 3 days straight now, an unusual pattern for this time of year. The locals joked that Mother Nature had forgotten to turn off the faucet, but Carol found herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, a small knot of unease forming in her stomach that she couldn't quite explain. "Carol! The vase you made for my daughter's wedding is absolutely perfect!" Emily Rodriguez burst through the studio door, shaking droplets from her umbrella. The younger woman's face glowed with excitement as she carefully carried a wrapped package. "I just picked it up from the kiln room. It's even more beautiful than I imagined." Carol smiled warmly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm so glad you're happy with it, Emily. Your daughter deserves something special for her big day." Emily had been one of Carol's first students when she opened the studio 15 years ago. Now a mother of 3 and the owner of the town's bookshop, Emily remained one of Carol's closest friends in Willow Creek. The town had embraced Carol from the moment she arrived, never pressing her about her past, accepting her simply as the kind woman who taught pottery and created beautiful pieces that decorated many of their homes. "You know, you should really teach an advanced class," Emily suggested, setting the package down carefully. "So many of us have been taking your beginner courses for years. We're ready for more complex techniques." "Perhaps," Carol replied non-committally, returning to her wheel. "I'll think about it." The truth was, Carol kept her classes simple deliberately. Complex pottery techniques reminded her too much of complex calculations, of stress analyses and structural integrity assessments of the professional life she had left behind. Simple bowls, basic vases, decorative plates. These were safe. These couldn't hurt anyone. "This rain is really something, isn't it?" Emily moved to the window, watching the water stream down the glass. "Old Mr. Patterson was saying he hasn't seen rain like this in 40 years. The creek is already higher than normal." Carol's hands stilled on the clay. "How much higher?" "Oh, I don't know exactly. Maybe a foot or so? My husband drove across the bridge this morning and said the water was definitely up." Emily turned back with a laugh. "Don't worry, Carol. Willow Creek has been here for over 100 years. We've weathered plenty of storms." After Emily left, Carol found herself unable to focus on her work. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the roof, and that small knot of unease in her stomach tightened. She cleaned her workspace early, locked up the studio, and drove home through the downpour, her windshield wipers working overtime. Her cottage sat on Oak Street, a quiet residential area where neighbors knew each other's names and looked out for one another. Carol had painted the shutters blue herself and planted roses along the fence. Small acts of domesticity that had helped her build a new identity, a peaceful identity, so different from the high-pressure world she'd escaped. That evening, she made herself a simple dinner of soup and bread, but found herself eating mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The rain hammered on, heavier now, and as darkness fell, Carol stood at her kitchen window, staring out into the wet night. 15 years. 15 peaceful years in Willow Creek, where nobody knew about her past life, where nobody knew that before she became the friendly pottery teacher on Main Street, she had been Dr. Carol Jensen, chief engineer for Morrison Hayes Engineering, one of the top dam construction firms in the country, where nobody knew that she had spent 40 years of her life designing, building, and inspecting some of the largest dams in North America, and where nobody knew about the Cedar Valley Dam disaster that had ended her career. Carol forced herself away from the window, made a cup of chamomile tea, and tried to read a book. but the words blurred on the page, and she found herself listening to the rain instead, remembering another storm, another time when she had ignored her instincts and people had paid the price. The nightmare came that night, as it always did when Carol was stressed. She was standing in the observation tower at Cedar Valley Dam, clipboard in hand, reviewing the daily inspection reports. The dam stretched before her, a massive concrete structure holding back billions of gallons of water. It was her masterpiece, the crowning achievement of her career. "Dr. Jensen, there's a small crack in Section C." Her assistant, Marcus, pointed to the structural diagram. "Should we be concerned?" In the dream, Carol waved it off. "We'll monitor it. It's probably just settlement. The dam is only 3 years old. Some minor cracking is normal." But it wasn't normal. The crack grew, and one rainy night, Section C failed catastrophically. Not the main dam. If that had failed, thousands would have died. But the auxiliary spillway collapsed, and 3 workers doing routine maintenance were swept away in the torrent of water. Carol woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, sweat soaking her nightshirt despite the cool air. She lay in the darkness, listening to the rain that still fell without pause, and felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. 3 lives, 3 families destroyed, because she had been too confident, too sure of her calculations, too dismissive of the warning signs. The company had cleared her of wrongdoing in the official investigation. An unpredictable structural failure, they called it. No engineer could have foreseen it. But Carol knew better. She had seen the crack. She had noted the unusual stress patterns in the computer models. She had felt that same knot of unease in her stomach that she felt now, and she had ignored it. She had resigned the day after the funerals, packed up her Denver apartment, and driven until she found Willow Creek, a small town so far from her old life that she could pretend to be someone else entirely. Morning came gray and wet. Carol dressed and made coffee, then stood at her living room window, watching the rain continue its assault on the town. She should go to the studio, she thought. She had classes scheduled for today. But that unease had grown into something sharper, more insistent. Her eyes drifted north, toward the hills that rose beyond the town. She couldn't see it from here, but she knew it was there. Lake Serenity Dam, built in 1952, a relatively small earthen dam that created the reservoir supplying water to Willow Creek and 3 other nearby towns. Carol had researched it briefly when she first moved here, purely out of professional habit, then had deliberately put it out of her mind. It was old, but it had stood for over 70 years without incident. Someone else's responsibility, not hers. But now, with this unprecedented rainfall, with the creek already swollen— "Stop it," Carol said aloud to herself. "You're not an engineer anymore. It's not your problem." She called her morning students to cancel class, citing a personal matter, then forced herself to go through her normal routine. She cleaned her already clean cottage. She watered her indoor plants. She tried to work on a new bowl design. But all the while, her engineer's mind was calculating rainfall accumulation, runoff coefficients, reservoir capacity, spillway adequacy. By afternoon, unable to bear it any longer, Carol got in her car and drove north out of town. She told herself she was just going for a drive, just getting some air, but her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she wound up the hill road toward Lake Serenity. The lake came into view first, its surface pockmarked by falling rain, its level noticeably higher than the markers on the shore indicated was normal. Then she saw the dam itself, and her breath caught in her throat. It was an earthen embankment dam, about 40 feet high and 300 feet across, with a concrete spillway on the eastern end. Not a large structure by the standards Carol was used to, but big enough to create a lake of several hundred acre-feet, and more importantly, big enough that if it failed, the resulting flood would hit Willow Creek with devastating force. Carol pulled over at the small observation area and sat in her car, engine running, wipers beating back and forth. Even from this distance, even through the rain, she could see things that made her professional instincts scream. The spillway was running full, which was normal during high rainfall, but the water coming over it was brown and turbulent, indicating high sediment content. That could mean erosion somewhere in the system. The lake level was within a foot of the dam's crest, much higher than it should be. And was that? Carol squinted through the rain and binoculars she kept in her glove box. Was that a wet spot on the downstream face of the embankment? It's nothing, she whispered to herself. It's been standing for 70 years. Someone maintains it. Someone is monitoring it. It's not your responsibility. But even as she tried to convince herself, her mind was filling with all the things that could go wrong with an aging earthen dam during extreme rainfall. Overtopping if the spillway couldn't handle the inflow. Piping failure if water began seeping through the embankment. Slope instability if the saturated earth became too heavy. Any of these could lead to catastrophic failure, and catastrophic failure would mean a wall of water racing down the valley directly toward Willow Creek, directly toward Emily and her 3 children, toward old Mr. Patterson and his wife, toward the Gomez family who ran the diner, toward all 2,000 people who lived in the town below, people who had welcomed her and given her a peaceful life for 15 years. Carol put the car in gear and drove back to town, her mind racing. She needed to find out who was responsible for the dam's safety. She needed to know if it was being monitored during this storm. She needed to know if anyone else saw what she saw. But to do that, she would have to reveal who she really was. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. Carol spent the evening in her cottage, laptop open, researching. It was surprisingly difficult to find current information about Lake Serenity Dam. The structure was owned by the Central Valley Water District, a regional utility that served several small towns. The most recent inspection report she could find online was from 5 years ago, and it was frustratingly vague, giving the dam a satisfactory rating without much detail. She knew from experience that satisfactory was a term that covered a wide range of actual conditions, from genuinely sound to concerning, but not critical enough to demand immediate action. And 5 years was a long time between inspections, especially for an aging earthen dam. The rain continued through the night, and Carol barely slept. When she did doze off, she dreamed of water, walls of it, crushing everything in its path. She woke at dawn feeling exhausted, but resolute. She couldn't just ignore this. She had to do something, even if it meant exposing her past. After breakfast, Carol drove to the Willow Creek Town Hall, a small brick building on the corner of Main and First. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Patricia, greeted her warmly. "Carol, what brings you in today? Please don't tell me you're here to complain about the rain. We've been getting that all week." Patricia laughed. "Actually, I have a question about Lake Serenity Dam," Carol said, trying to keep her voice casual. "With all this rain, I was just curious about whether someone monitors the water level up there." Patricia's smile faded slightly. "You know, you're the second person to ask about that this week. Is there something we should be worried about?" "Who else asked?" Carol felt her pulse quicken. "Tim Bradley, from the County Public Works. He stopped by yesterday wanting to know the same thing. Mayor Henderson told him that the dam is the water district's responsibility, not ours. We just have an agreement to use the water." "Is the mayor in today?" "She's at a conference in the state capitol. Won't be back until next week. Is there something specific you need, Carol?" Carol hesitated. "Could you give me the contact information for whoever manages the dam for the water district?" Patricia typed on her computer. That would be… Let me see. The district's main office is in Riverside Falls, about an hour from here. The manager is Frank Holloway. Would you like his number? Armed with the contact information, Carol returned to her car and sat in the parking lot, staring at her phone. This was it. The moment where she would have to step out of her safe, anonymous life and back into the world of engineering, of professional responsibility, of potential blame if she was wrong. But what if she was right? What if the dam was in danger and she said nothing? She made the call. Central Valley Water District, Frank Holloway speaking. The voice was gruff, impatient. Mr. Holloway, my name is Carol Jensen. I live in Willow Creek, and I'm concerned about Lake Serenity Dam given the current rainfall. Uh-huh. And what makes you concerned, Ms. Jensen? Are you a hydrologist? An engineer? The question hung in the air. Carol closed her eyes. I'm a retired civil engineer. I specialized in dam construction and safety. I visited the dam yesterday, and I observed several concerning indicators that suggest the structure may be under more stress than is safe. There was a pause. You're an engineer. What kind of indicators? High sediment content in the spillway discharge suggests possible internal erosion. The lake level is very close to the dam crest, and I observed what appeared to be seepage on the downstream face of the embankment. Any one of these might be normal, but all three together, during an unprecedented rainfall event, warrants immediate investigation. Another pause, longer this time. Ms. Jensen, I appreciate your concern, but Lake Serenity has been standing since 1952. We have regular inspections. The structure is sound. When was the last inspection? We conduct visual inspections annually and comprehensive structural assessments every 5 years as required by state regulations. When was the last comprehensive assessment? Carol heard papers shuffling. According to our records, 5 years ago. The next one is scheduled for this summer. So you're due for one. And when was the last visual inspection? Last fall, before the rainy season. So you haven't had anyone look at it since this storm system began? Mr. Holloway, we've had 3 days of continuous heavy rain, with more forecasted. That dam is holding back a significantly increased volume of water. Don't you think it warrants a look? Ms. Jensen, I understand your concern, but I have 3 other reservoirs to manage, a limited staff, and a budget that doesn't allow for running up to every facility every time it rains. Lake Serenity has multiple redundant safety features. The spillway is designed to handle major flood events. We monitor the lake level remotely. If there were a real problem, our sensors would alert us. What if your sensors are wrong? What if there's a developing issue that won't show up on lake level alone? Then it will show up on our next visual inspection, which is scheduled for next month when the weather clears. Look, I appreciate your professional concern, but honestly, we know our infrastructure. Have a good day, Ms. Jensen. The call ended. Carol sat in her car, frustration and fear warring in her chest. He hadn't taken her seriously. Why would he? She was just a voice on the phone, a stranger making claims about his facility. He had regulations to follow, budgets to consider, other priorities. From his perspective, she probably sounded like an alarmist. But she knew what she had seen, and she knew that earthen dams could fail suddenly, without warning, when internal stresses reached a critical threshold. That evening, Carol attended the weekly town council meeting. She usually avoided these gatherings, preferring to keep a low profile. But tonight she sat in the back row of the small meeting room, waiting for the open comment period. The council discussed routine matters, a new stop sign at the school, repairs to the community center roof, the annual summer festival planning. Finally, Mayor Henderson's deputy, Robert Chen, opened the floor for public comments. Carol stood, her legs slightly unsteady. Every head in the room turned toward her. She recognized most of the faces. Emily Rodriguez, old Mr. Patterson, the Gomez family, Tom Hendricks, who owned the hardware store, Sarah Williams from the library. All people she had shared 15 years of quiet, peaceful life with. All people who were about to learn the truth about her. "My name is Carol Jensen," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "I've lived in Willow Creek for 15 years, and I've never spoken at one of these meetings before. But tonight I need to tell you all something important." She paused, gathering her courage. "Before I moved here, I was a civil engineer. I specialized in dam design and safety. I worked on major dam projects for 40 years. Surprised murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Emily's eyes widened. "I moved to Willow Creek to retire and start a quieter life," Carol continued, which was technically true, if incomplete. "I never mentioned my background because I wanted to leave that professional life behind. But this week, with the unprecedented rainfall we've been experiencing, I became concerned about Lake Serenity Dam." "The dam up on the hill?" Tom Hendricks asked. "The one that makes the lake?" "Yes. I drove up there yesterday to look at it, and I saw several signs that concern me from an engineering perspective. I contacted the water district today, but they don't plan to inspect it until next month. I believe that may be too late." Robert Chen leaned forward. "What kind of signs, Ms. Jensen?" Carol explained the sediment in the spillway water, the high lake level, the possible seepage. As she spoke, she could see the reactions on people's faces shifting from surprise to confusion to concern. "But the dam has been there for 70 years, Mr. Patterson said. "Surely if it was dangerous, someone would have done something about it by now." "Dams age," Carol replied. "Small problems develop into larger ones, and extreme events, like this storm, can accelerate failure processes that might otherwise take years. I'm not saying the dam will definitely fail. I'm saying there are warning signs that should be investigated immediately, and the responsible agency is not taking those signs seriously enough." "What exactly are you proposing we do?" asked Sarah Williams. "I think we should send an official request from the town to the water district, asking for an immediate inspection. We should also contact the state dam safety office and make them aware of the situation. And—" Carol took a deep breath. "We should consider developing an emergency evacuation plan, just in case." The room erupted in conversation. Some people looked frightened. Others seemed skeptical. A few appeared annoyed that their peaceful evening meeting had been disrupted with talk of disaster. Robert Chen held up his hands for quiet. Okay, let's think about this rationally. Ms. Jensen, you said you're a retired engineer. What exactly did you do? What are your credentials?" This was the moment Carol had dreaded. "I was chief engineer for Morrison Hayes Engineering. I led design and construction projects for dams in 7 states. I have a doctorate in civil engineering from MIT. I spent my entire career working with these structures." "Then why are you teaching pottery in Willow Creek?" Tom Hendricks asked, not unkindly but with genuine puzzlement. Carol felt all eyes on her. "I retired early due to personal reasons. That's not relevant to the current situation. What's relevant is that I know dams, and I know the signs of potential failure, and I'm telling you that we need to take this seriously." "Personal reasons," someone muttered in the back. Carol didn't see who. Robert Chen made some notes. "I'll contact the water district first thing tomorrow morning, and I'll reach out to the state dam safety office as well. But Ms. Jensen, you should understand that if you're wrong about this, you'll be causing a lot of unnecessary alarm. And if you're right, well, we're talking about potentially evacuating the town. That's not something we can just do on the word of someone who, with all due respect, we don't really know in a professional capacity." "I understand," Carol said quietly. I'm not asking you to evacuate based on my word alone. I'm asking you to get a qualified inspector out there to verify or refute my concerns. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize publicly. But if I'm right, and we do nothing, people could die. The meeting continued for another hour, but Carol barely heard any of it. She had done what she came to do. Now it was out of her hands, or so she tried to tell herself. As people filed out of the meeting room, Emily approached her. "Carol, I had no idea. A chief engineer? MIT? Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I wanted a fresh start, Emily. A simple life. I'm sorry I didn't tell you." "Don't apologize, I'm just surprised. And a little scared, to be honest. Is the dam really in danger?" Carol looked at her friend's worried face and chose her words carefully. "I don't know for certain, but I've seen enough to believe it needs to be checked immediately. How are your kids?" "They're with my mom tonight. Carol, if something happens, if the dam actually... what do we do?" "If the dam fails, the water will hit the north end of town first, probably within 10 to 15 minutes. You'd have very little time to get to high ground. The library, the old school building on the hill, the church on Oak Ridge, those would be safe. But Emily, I hope I'm wrong. I really do." After Emily left, Carol walked slowly to her car through the drizzle. The heavy rain had eased to a persistent shower, but the sky remained dark and threatening, promising more to come. She had exposed herself, made herself vulnerable to questions she didn't want to answer. But she had also done the right thing, or at least she hoped she had. The next morning, Carol woke to the sound of her doorbell. She pulled on a robe and found Robert Chen standing on her porch, looking tired and worried. "Ms. Jensen, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but I need your expertise. I spoke with Frank Holloway at the Water District this morning. He's agreed to send someone to inspect the dam today, but he also sent me the most recent inspection report from 5 years ago. I don't understand most of it. Would you be willing to look at it?" Carol invited him in, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table reviewing the document. It was exactly the kind of report she had seen hundreds of times in her career. Lots of technical jargon, measurements, assessments of various components, and an overall rating. This one rated Lake Serenity Dam as satisfactory, with minor maintenance items recommended. But as Carol read more carefully, her concern deepened. "Look at this," she pointed to a paragraph. 5 years ago, they noted minor seepage at Station 45. That's about halfway along the downstream face. They recommended continued monitoring. But seepage in an earthen dam isn't something you just monitor. It's a sign that water is finding a path through or under the dam, and that path can erode and enlarge over time. "But they said minor," Robert objected. 5 years ago, it was minor. What is it today? And here, she flipped to another page, they note that the spillway capacity is adequate for the design flood event. But climate patterns have changed since this dam was built in 1952. We're experiencing rainfall intensities that weren't anticipated in the original design. That spillway might not be adequate anymore. Robert rubbed his face tiredly. "Okay. So what do I tell people? Half the town is panicking after last night's meeting. The other half thinks you're overreacting. The diner was full of arguments this morning. Tell them the truth. We need an expert inspection to determine if there's real danger. When is the Water District sending someone?" "This afternoon. A guy named Richard Foster, one of their senior engineers." Carol felt a flicker of hope. If they were sending an engineer, someone who would understand the technical issues, maybe something would actually get done. "Would you be willing to go up there with me when he arrives?" Robert asked. "I know I'm asking a lot, but I need someone who can speak his language. And right now, you're the only person in town with that expertise." Carol agreed, though the prospect of meeting another dam engineer, of being back in that professional world even briefly made her anxious. She spent the morning trying to work in her studio, but her hands were too unsteady to throw pottery. Instead, she made lists of questions for Richard Foster, drew diagrams of the dam from memory, and tried to prepare herself for the conversation ahead. At 2 o'clock, Robert picked her up, and they drove to the dam together. The rain had stopped temporarily, though dark clouds still hung low over the hills. As they pulled into the observation area, Carol saw a white truck with the Water District logo parked there, and a man in a yellow rain jacket standing at the edge of the embankment, looking down at the downstream face. Richard Foster was younger than Carol expected, maybe in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the serious expression of someone who took his work seriously. He turned as they approached, and Carol saw him assess her quickly. An older woman in jeans and a windbreaker, not exactly the image of a chief engineer. "Mr. Foster, I'm Robert Chen from Willow Creek. This is Carol Jensen, the engineer I mentioned on the phone." Foster shook hands with both of them, his grip firm. "Ms. Jensen, Frank Holloway mentioned you called yesterday. Said you used to work in dam engineering?" "I was chief engineer at Morrison Hayes for 25 years, Carol replied evenly. "Before that, I was a project engineer for 12 years at Bartlett Simmons. I've designed or inspected over 40 large dams." Something shifted in Foster's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "Morrison Hayes, that's serious credentials. What brings you to a small town like Willow Creek?" "Retirement. Mr. Foster, thank you for coming out on short notice. What have you found?" They walked along the dam crest together, Foster pointing out various features while Carol listened and observed. The water was indeed very close to the top of the dam, with less than 18 inches of freeboard, the vertical distance between the water surface and the crest. The spillway was running at near capacity, and the lake continued to rise despite the spillway's efforts to release water. "The spillway is functioning as designed," Foster said. "It can handle the current inflow. The problem is that we've had so much rain that the lake level has risen faster than the spillway can release it. We're within design parameters, but just barely." "What about the seepage?" Carol asked. Foster's expression became more guarded. "There is some seepage at the downstream toe, yes, but seepage is normal in an earthen dam. As long as it's clear water and not carrying soil particles, it's not a structural concern. May I look at it?" They walked down the wet grass of the downstream face to where water was emerging from the base of the embankment. Carol knelt down, examining the water carefully. It was running clear, which was good. Turbid water would indicate internal erosion, but the flow rate seemed higher than she would expect from normal seepage. "Has this flow increased recently?" she asked. "I don't have baseline data to compare against," Foster admitted. "The last visual inspection was 7 months ago, and the notes just say minor seepage at Station 45, which is about here." Carol stood, looking up at the massive earthen wall above them. "Mr. Foster, I understand you have to follow protocols and regulations, but in your professional opinion, given everything you've seen today, do you think this dam is safe to continue operating at this lake level?" Foster was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "The dam is not in immediate danger of failure. However, given the continued rainfall forecast and the current high lake level, I'm going to recommend that we implement increased monitoring. We'll install additional monitoring equipment to track seepage flow rates and piezometric levels inside the embankment. And I'm going to suggest we consider a controlled lowering of the lake level if the rain continues." "How long will it take to install monitoring equipment and start lowering the lake?" "The equipment can be in place by tomorrow. Lowering the lake is more complicated. We have downstream water users who depend on releases from this reservoir. We'd need to coordinate with them, get approvals, maybe 3 or 4 days to get everything set up. And if the dam develops a problem before then, Foster met her eyes. Then we'd have an emergency situation. But Ms. Jensen, I've inspected dozens of dams in my career. I know a critical situation when I see one. This isn't it. This is a precautionary situation. There's a difference. Carol wanted to believe him. He seemed competent and conscientious. But she also knew that dam failures often surprised even experienced engineers. The warning signs could be subtle until suddenly they weren't, until the structure reached a tipping point and catastrophe unfolded in minutes. I hope you're right, she said quietly. On the drive back to town, Robert was relieved. So it sounds like everything is under control, right? They're going to monitor it and lower the lake level if needed. That's good news. It's better than nothing, Carol replied. But Robert, I need you to understand something. If this dam has a problem, a real problem, it won't give us much warning. We need to have an evacuation plan ready, just in case. I'll work on that. Can you help? You know better than anyone what we're facing. And so, that evening, Carol found herself sitting in Robert Chen's office with a map of Willow Creek spread across the desk, marking flood zones, identifying evacuation routes, and calculating how much time they would have if the worst happened. According to her rough calculations, if the dam failed completely, the resulting flood wave would reach the northern edge of Willow Creek in approximately 12 minutes. The town had 20 minutes, maybe 25, to evacuate the most vulnerable areas. Not much time, but possibly enough if people were prepared and moved quickly. We need to notify people about evacuation routes, Carol said. Make sure everyone knows where to go if there's an alarm. And we need a warning system, something that will alert people immediately if there's a failure. The town has tornado sirens, Robert said. We could use those. Good. Test them. Make sure everyone knows what they mean. And Robert, you should have emergency services on standby. Ambulances, fire department, anyone who might be needed. You really think it could happen, don't you? Carol looked at the map, at the streets where she had walked for 15 years, at the small dots representing buildings where people lived and worked and raised families. I think we need to be prepared for the possibility, she said. But to do that, she would have to reveal who she really was, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. The next 3 days were among the most stressful of Carol's life. The water district installed monitoring equipment at the dam, and Richard Foster sent her updates twice daily on lake levels, seepage rates, and piezometric pressures inside the embankment. The news was neither terrible nor reassuring. The dam was stable but stressed. The lake level was slowly dropping as they began controlled releases, but rain continued to fall intermittently, refilling what they tried to drain. Carol couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time. She kept her phone next to her bed, charged and ready. She packed a small bag with essentials and kept it by her door. And she watched the weather forecasts obsessively, seeing that more rain was predicted for the weekend. The town reacted in various ways to the situation. Some people, especially those who remembered floods from decades past, took the warnings seriously. They made their own emergency plans, stocked supplies, and kept vehicles fueled and ready. Others, particularly long-time residents who had lived under the dam for generations without incident, thought the concern was overblown. That dam has been there since my grandfather's time, Mr. Patterson told Carol when she ran into him at the grocery store. It's not going anywhere. Carol wanted to explain to him that dams aged, that small problems accumulated, that unprecedented weather events tested structures in ways they were never designed to handle. But she could see in his eyes that he had made up his mind. Some people needed to believe in permanence, in the reliability of the familiar. The alternative was too frightening. Emily, on the other hand, took the threat very seriously. She and her husband made a plan with their children, practicing evacuation routes and choosing a meeting place. The kids think it's an adventure, Emily told Carol over coffee at the diner. I'm trying not to scare them, but I'm terrified, Carol. What if something happens in the middle of the night? What if we don't get enough warning? You'll get warning, Carol assured her, hoping she was right. Richard Foster is monitoring the dam carefully. If there's any sign of imminent failure, he'll notify the town immediately. The sirens will sound. You'll have time. How much time? Carol didn't want to lie to her friend. Probably 20 minutes, maybe less. But it's enough time to get to high ground if you don't waste it gathering possessions. You grab your kids and you run. That's all you think about. Emily's face paled. 20 minutes. It might not come to that. The dam might be fine. But if it does happen, you have to be ready to move fast. That conversation haunted Carol. She had spent her career thinking about dams as engineering problems, as mathematical models and structural analyses. But now she was thinking about them as threats to people she cared about, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. On the fourth day, the rain stopped. The clouds broke apart, and sunshine fell on Willow Creek for the first time in over a week. People emerged from their homes with relief, squinting at the blue sky. The creek began to recede from its swollen banks. Carol checked with Richard Foster, who reported that the lake level was dropping steadily now that rainfall had ceased. We're not out of the woods yet, Foster cautioned. The embankment is saturated, which means it's heavier and more prone to slope instability. And there's more rain in the long-range forecast. But for now, things are improving. Carol allowed herself to hope. Maybe she had been wrong to worry so much. Maybe the old dam would prove more resilient than she feared. Maybe her trauma from Cedar Valley had made her overly cautious, seeing dangers that weren't really there. She returned to teaching pottery classes, and her students were full of questions about her engineering background. She answered what she could, deflecting the more personal inquiries. Yes, she had worked on major projects. Yes, it had been interesting work. No, she didn't miss it particularly. Yes, she much preferred the peaceful life of Willow Creek. The lies came easier now. She had been telling them for 15 years. On the 6th day after her initial warning, Carol was working late in her studio, trying to catch up on orders she had neglected during the crisis. It was past 9 o'clock when her phone rang. She saw Richard Foster's name on the screen and felt her stomach drop. Ms. Jensen, we have a situation. Carol's hand tightened on the phone. Tell me. The monitoring equipment is showing a sudden increase in piezometric pressure in the lower third of the embankment. That combined with an increase in seepage flow rate and some turbidity in the seepage water. I've been watching it for the past 3 hours, hoping it would stabilize, but it's getting worse. How fast is it deteriorating? Faster than I'm comfortable with. I've notified my supervisor, and we're trying to decide whether this constitutes an emergency situation requiring immediate action. You're trying to decide? Carol's voice rose. Mr. Foster, what you're describing sounds like the beginning of internal erosion failure. Once that process starts, it can accelerate exponentially. You might have hours, or you might have minutes before the embankment becomes unstable. I know that, Ms. Jensen. But declaring an emergency means evacuating the town. And if you're wrong, people are inconvenienced for a night. If you're right and you do nothing, people die. This isn't a difficult decision, Mr. Foster. There was silence on the line. Then Foster said quietly, I'm recommending immediate evacuation. But it's not my call alone. I need approval from my supervisor and from the State Dam Safety Office. That could take an hour or more. An hour we might not have. I know. Ms. Jensen, I'm going to send you the latest monitoring data. Can you review it and give me your professional assessment? If a senior engineer with your credentials agrees that this is an emergency, it will carry weight with the decision makers. Send it now. Carol's laptop was in her car. She ran out into the dark street, grabbed it, and returned to the studio. Her hands shook as she opened the files Foster sent. Graphs, numbers, measurements, the language of engineering crisis. The piezometric pressures were wrong. Very wrong. They showed water infiltrating deep into the embankment in ways that indicated the internal structure was compromised. The seepage flow rate had tripled in 3 hours, and the turbidity measurements showed sediment in the water, meaning soil particles were being carried out of the dam. Carol had seen data like this once before, in the hours before the Cedar Valley spillway collapsed. She had looked at similar graphs and told herself it would be fine, that she was being paranoid, that the structure was sound. She wouldn't make that mistake again. "Mr. Foster," she called him back. "This is Dr. Carol Jensen, retired chief engineer, Morrison Hayes Engineering. Based on the data you've sent me, I am giving you my professional assessment that Lake Serenity Dam is in imminent danger of failure. The monitoring data indicates progressive internal erosion that, if left unchecked, will likely lead to catastrophic embankment breach within hours. I strongly recommend immediate evacuation of all areas downstream of the dam." She heard Foster take a shaky breath. "Thank you, Dr. Jensen. I'm calling my supervisor now." Carol hung up and immediately called Robert Chen. "Robert, the dam is failing. We need to evacuate the town. Now." "Carol, it's 9:30 at night. Are you sure?" "The engineer on site has monitoring data showing internal erosion. He's asking for approval to evacuate, but that could take time we don't have. Robert, as deputy mayor, don't you have the authority to activate emergency procedures?" Yes, technically, but Carol, if this is a false alarm, better a false alarm than a disaster. Robert, please, trust me on this." She heard him breathing, making the calculation, weighing the risks. Then, "Okay, I'll activate the emergency system. God help me if you're wrong. God help us all if I'm right." Within 15 minutes, the tornado sirens began to wail across Willow Creek. Carol had never heard a sound more terrifying or more necessary. She locked her studio, grabbed her emergency bag from home, and drove to the town hall, which was designated as the Emergency Coordination Center. The streets were already filling with confused, frightened people. Lights came on in houses. Cars started pulling out of driveways. Some people clearly had no idea what was happening. Others, who had attended the town meeting or heard the warnings, moved with purpose toward the designated evacuation areas on higher ground. Robert Chen was at the town hall with a handful of volunteers, working phones and radios. "The sheriff's department is going door to door in the flood zone," he told Carol. "Fire department is setting up at the evacuation points. But Carol, people are asking what's happening, and I don't know what to tell them. Tell them there's a potential dam failure and they need to move to high ground immediately. Don't take possessions, don't stop to pack, just go. How long until everyone in the flood zone is notified? Maybe 30 minutes? Make it 20. We might not have 30. Carol moved to a wall map of the town and began coordinating with the sheriff's deputies via radio, directing them to areas where elderly or disabled residents might need assistance. Emily called, confirming that her family was already heading to the church on Oak Ridge. Mr. Patterson called, angry and confused, demanding to know what was really going on. "Mr. Patterson, please just get to high ground," Carol pleaded. "I'll explain everything later, but right now you need to move." "You're causing a panic over nothing," he shouted into the phone. "Better a panic than a funeral," Carol replied, and hung up. The next hour was chaos. Reports came in of traffic jams on the roads leading out of the valley. An elderly woman had fallen in her panic to evacuate and needed medical attention. A family couldn't find their cat and refused to leave without it. Small dramas and large fears collided as 2,000 people tried to move to safety in the dark. Carol stayed at the map, tracking which areas had been cleared, which roads were still congested, where help was needed. Part of her mind marveled at how much she had fallen back into the role of crisis manager, the professional competence she thought she had left behind. But mostly, she just focused on the work, on making sure everyone got out. At 10:45, Richard Foster called. "Dr. Jensen, the monitoring data is getting worse. The seepage is carrying heavy sediment now. We can actually see the downstream face beginning to slump. I've got approval for evacuation, but I'm hearing you've already started." Deputy Mayor Chen activated emergency procedures an hour ago. How long do we have? I don't know. Maybe an hour, maybe less. I'm evacuating myself and my crew from the dam site. It's too dangerous to stay. Get out, Mr. Foster, and thank you for calling. Carol turned to Robert. The dam is actively failing. We need to make sure everyone is out of the flood zone now. We're trying, Carol. We're trying. By 11:30, the sheriff's department reported that all residences in the primary flood zone had been checked and cleared. Some people had refused to evacuate, and deputies had to use considerable persuasion to get them moving. But as far as they could tell, everyone who lived in the path of a potential flood was now on high ground or out of the valley. Carol allowed herself a moment of relief. Then she called Emily. "We're at the church," Emily said, her voice tight with stress. "There must be 500 people here. The kids are scared, Carol. Everyone's scared. Is it really going to happen?" "I don't know, but you're safe there. The church is high enough that even if the dam fails completely, the water won't reach you." "What about you? Where are you?" "I'm at the town hall with Robert." "Carol, the town hall is in the flood zone. Get out of there." Carol looked around at the emergency coordination center, at Robert and the volunteers still working phones and radios, coordinating the evacuation and response. "We can't leave yet, Emily. There's still work to do." "You're the one who told me to run. Don't be a hypot." The line went dead. Carol looked at her phone and saw she had lost signal. She tried calling back, but nothing connected. Robert looked up from his radio. Phone system just went down, probably overloaded from everyone trying to call each other. "We should move the command center to the church," Carol said. "We're too exposed here." "Give me 5 more minutes. I want to make sure all the emergency vehicles are accounted for." Carol walked to the window and looked out at Main Street. It was almost midnight now, and the town was strangely quiet after the chaos of evacuation. A few streetlights still glowed. She could see her pottery studio across the street, dark and empty. 15 years of her life in this town. 15 years of peace and simple work, of trying to forget what she had been. And now it was all at risk because of the one thing she couldn't escape. Dams. "Robert, we need to go. Now." He started gathering papers. Okay, let me just... The lights flickered and went out, plunging the town hall into darkness. "Power's out," Robert said unnecessarily. Carol fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. "Come on, we're leaving." They had just reached Robert's car when they heard it. A deep, rumbling sound from the north, like distant thunder, but continuous and growing louder. Carol's blood ran cold. She had heard that sound before, in training videos, in simulations, in her nightmares. It was the sound of a dam failing. "Drive!" she shouted at Robert. "Drive now!" Robert's car tore out of the parking lot, heading uphill toward the church. Carol twisted in her seat, looking back toward the north end of town. In the darkness, she couldn't see much, but she could hear that terrible rumbling growing closer, could feel it in her chest like a physical force. "How much time do we have?" Robert asked, his voice high with fear. Carol tried to calculate in her head. The dam was roughly 3 miles from downtown Willow Creek. Water traveling downhill through a narrow valley could reach speeds of 20 to 30 miles per hour. That meant 6 minutes, she said. Maybe less. Robert, you need to get us to high ground in the next 5 minutes. He pushed the accelerator to the floor. The car raced through the empty streets, taking corners too fast, engine screaming. Carol gripped the door handle and prayed they would make it. They passed through downtown and started up Oak Ridge Road, climbing toward the church. Carol looked in the side mirror and saw the first evidence of the flood. A dark wall of water exploding into the north end of town, demolishing houses like they were made of paper, carrying debris and destruction in a churning mass of unstoppable force. "Faster!" she urged, though the car was already going as fast as it could up the steep hill. The flood spread through the valley below them, following the creek bed but also surging outward, filling streets, smashing through buildings, consuming everything in its path. Carol watched her pottery studio vanish beneath the black water, watched Main Street become a raging river, watched 15 years of her quiet life swept away in minutes. Robert skidded into the church parking lot just as the flood reached the base of Oak Ridge. They stumbled out of the car and ran inside, where hundreds of frightened people had been watching from the windows. Emily rushed to Carol, pulling her into a fierce hug. "I saw you coming up the hill. I thought you wouldn't make it." "We made it," Carol said, though her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. From the church's position on the hill, they had a clear view of the disaster unfolding below. The flood had hit with devastating force, but because of the evacuation, the streets were empty. There were no cars on the roads, no people in the houses, no one to be swept away by the dark water. Carol watched in silence, Robert beside her, as Willow Creek drowned. Buildings collapsed, cars tumbled through the flood like toys, power lines snapped and sparked. The roar of water was tremendous, an angry sound of nature reclaiming space it had been denied. But no one screamed. No one cried for help, because everyone was here, safe on high ground, watching their town die but knowing they would live. The flood raged for nearly an hour before it began to subside. The initial surge was the most violent, but even as it ebbed, the water remained high, filling the valley floor to a depth of 10 or 12 feet. In the moonlight that broke through the clouds, Carol could see the devastation. Buildings torn from foundations, vehicles piled against bridge abutments, a landscape transformed from familiar streets into an alien waterscape of debris and destruction. "My house," someone sobbed behind her. "Our home." "The diner," another voice said in disbelief. 3 generations, gone." People began to cry, to comfort each other, to process the magnitude of what they were seeing. Robert moved among them, trying to organize a headcount, to make sure everyone was accounted for, to begin the impossible task of dealing with this disaster. But Carol just stood at the window, watching, remembering another flood, another disaster, other lives that hadn't been saved. Emily took her hand. "You saved us, Carol. If you hadn't warned us, if we hadn't evacuated, we'd all be dead. The town is destroyed. The town is buildings. We're the town, and we're alive because of you." Throughout the night, people approached Carol to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her she was a hero. She accepted their gratitude numbly, unable to feel anything except a strange emptiness. She had saved them, yes, but she had also failed to prevent the disaster in the first place. If she had pushed harder, acted sooner, convinced the water district to lower the lake level faster. "Stop it," Emily said quietly, reading her thoughts. "You did everything you could, more than anyone else would have done." As dawn broke over the flooded valley, the full extent of the damage became visible. The entire north end of Willow Creek was underwater. Downtown was heavily damaged, with only the sturdiest brick buildings still standing, though clearly compromised. The south end of town, on slightly higher ground, had escaped the worst of the flooding, but still showed significant damage. It would be days before the water receded enough for people to return and assess the damage to their individual properties. But early estimates suggested that 60 to 70% of the town's structures were either destroyed or severely damaged. And yet, as the morning sun rose and people began to organize themselves, as volunteers stepped forward to help coordinate relief efforts, as families counted their blessings that everyone they loved was safe, Carol realized something important. Willow Creek might be destroyed, but the people of Willow Creek were not. They had survived. And they had survived because she had overcome her fear of her past, had embraced her professional knowledge one more time, had chosen to act even when it meant exposing herself to questions she didn't want to answer. The next few days blurred together in a haze of emergency response. The state sent in disaster relief teams. The National Guard arrived to help with security and logistics. The Red Cross set up shelters. Federal emergency management officials came to assess damage and coordinate aid. Carol found herself thrust into a leadership role she hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. Because she understood the engineering aspects of the disaster, because she could explain what had happened and why, because she had credibility with both the technical experts and the local community, she became a crucial link between the various response agencies and the people of Willow Creek. She briefed federal engineers on the dam failure mechanism. She helped state officials understand the town's infrastructure needs. She translated technical reports into plain language for town residents who wanted to know when they could return home, what could be salvaged, how long recovery would take. Richard Foster came to see her on the third day after the flood. He looked exhausted and years older than when she had first met him. "Dr. Jensen, I owe you an apology. If I had acted on your initial warning, if I had pushed harder for immediate action instead of waiting for approval, you did what you thought was right based on the information and authority you had," Carol interrupted. "I know how the system works, Mr. Foster. You had protocols to follow, supervisors to answer to. I don't blame you." "The official investigation will probably blame someone," Foster said bitterly. "The dam was my responsibility. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. I should have recommended lowering the lake level immediately instead of waiting." Carol looked at the younger engineer and saw herself at that age, convinced that perfect knowledge and perfect decisions were possible, that disasters happened only when someone made a mistake. "There will be blame to go around," she said quietly. "That's how these things work. They'll investigate. They'll find contributing factors. They'll make recommendations for the future. But Mr. Foster, I've been through this before. I know what comes next. And I want you to remember something. You did not build a defective dam. You did not create the unprecedented rainfall. You made the best decisions you could with the information available at the time. That's all any of us can do." He left looking somewhat comforted, though Carol knew the investigation would be hard on him. It would be hard on everyone involved. The media discovered Carol's background, and suddenly she was being interviewed by reporters who wanted to know about the retired engineer who saved a town. She tried to deflect, to emphasize the evacuation efforts by the sheriff's department and fire department, by Robert Chen and the many volunteers. But the narrative had already formed. Carol Jensen, the hero of Willow Creek. It felt hollow. She had saved this town, yes, but she hadn't saved the workers at Cedar Valley. Why did one success erase one failure? Why did preventing one disaster make her a hero when failing to prevent another had made her quit her profession? On the fifth day, with the floodwaters finally receding enough for assessment teams to enter the damaged areas, Emily found Carol sitting alone in a corner of the church shelter, staring at nothing. "Carol, there's someone here to see you." A man in his 60s stood behind Emily, wearing the crisp uniform of a state dam safety inspector. He had kind eyes and a weathered face that suggested years of field work. Dr. Jensen, I'm Warren Mitchell, Chief of the State Dam Safety Office. I wonder if I could speak with you privately. They walked outside into the cool morning air. Emergency vehicles still filled the roads, and the sound of generators and heavy equipment echoed from the valley below. I've been reviewing the records of the Lake Serenity Dam failure, Mitchell began. I've also been looking into your background. Morrison Hayes Engineering, 40 years in the field. Impressive career. Until it wasn't, Carol said quietly. Mitchell looked at her sharply. You're referring to Cedar Valley? You did your research. I was a junior inspector at the time. I remember the case. 3 workers killed when an auxiliary spillway failed. The company cleared you of wrongdoing. The official report called it an unpredictable structural failure. I should have seen it coming. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I read your original inspection notes from 6 months before the failure. You identified the crack. You recommended monitoring. You followed every protocol. Dr. Jensen, I've been doing this work for 35 years. I've investigated dozens of dam failures and near failures, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that what happened at Cedar Valley was not your fault. I could have pushed harder. I could have shut down the section for repairs. Based on what? A minor crack within acceptable limits? Dr. Jensen, if we shut down every dam that showed minor cracking, we'd have no water infrastructure at all. You made the right call based on the information available. The failure was caused by a hidden geological weakness that couldn't have been detected with the technology available at the time. You know this. You've read the reports. I read them. I didn't believe them. Mitchell sighed. 15 years of guilt. 15 years of hiding from your profession. And then, when your knowledge was needed, you stepped forward anyway. That takes courage, Dr. Jensen. Or desperation. I couldn't let it happen again. And it didn't. Because of you, not a single person died in this flood. Do you know how rare that is? How many dam failure evacuations I've investigated where we counted bodies instead of blessings? Carol looked down at the valley, at her destroyed town, at the place where she had tried to escape her past, only to have it find her anyway. The town is gone, she said. The town is alive. Buildings can be rebuilt. Lives cannot. You gave these people the one thing that matters most, a future. I wish you could see that the way they see it. After Mitchell left, Carol sat on a bench outside the church and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. People moved around her, organizing, planning, beginning the long process of recovery. Children played despite the disaster, their resilience a lesson to their parents. Carol! Robert Chen hurried over, tablet in hand. The governor's office called. They want you to serve on the commission investigating the dam failure. They said your expertise and first-hand knowledge would be invaluable. I'm not sure I'm the right person. They specifically asked for you. And Carol, there's more. Morrison Hayes Engineering contacted me. They want to talk to you about consulting work. And 3 other engineering firms have called. Apparently, word has gotten out about your background, and people remember your reputation. Carol felt a flutter of something in her chest. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. I retired for a reason, Robert. I know, but maybe the reason isn't valid anymore. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. The investigation into the Lake Serenity Dam failure took 6 months. Carol served on the technical review panel, working alongside other engineers to piece together exactly what had happened and why. It was painful work, forcing her to relive the disaster and her role in it, but it was also necessary. The final report identified multiple contributing factors: inadequate maintenance over decades, insufficient spillway capacity for modern rainfall patterns, delayed response to warning signs, and an organizational culture that prioritized budget concerns over safety. Richard Foster was criticized for not acting more quickly, but was not found primarily responsible. The water district underwent major reorganization. Through it all, Carol wrote a detailed technical appendix about the failure mechanism, the lessons to be learned, and recommendations for preventing similar disasters. It was the first serious engineering work she had done in 15 years, and she was surprised by how natural it felt, how her mind still worked in calculations and analyses, how her professional knowledge was still there, waiting to be used. Willow Creek began to rebuild. Insurance money and federal disaster aid flowed in. Some families chose to relocate, unable to face the trauma of living under the site of the failed dam. But most stayed, determined to restore their community. Carol's pottery studio was gone, swept away in the flood. She could have rebuilt it, could have returned to her simple life of teaching and creating. But something had changed in her. The work with the investigation had reminded her of who she had been, of the skills she possessed, of the good she could do. When Morrison Hayes Engineering formally offered her a consulting position, she surprised herself by accepting. Not full-time. She was 67 years old and had no desire to return to the pressures of major project management. But part-time, reviewing dam safety assessments, mentoring younger engineers, sharing her hard-won knowledge with a new generation. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked when Carol told her. They were sitting in the temporary cafe that had replaced the Gomez family's destroyed diner. "I thought you wanted to leave engineering behind." "I thought I did too," Carol admitted. "But Emily, I spent 15 years trying to forget who I was, trying to pretend I was just a pottery teacher with no past. And you know what? It didn't work. Cedar Valley still haunted me. The guilt didn't go away just because I changed careers. So what's different now? Now I've seen what happens when I use my knowledge instead of hiding from it. I saved this town, Emily. Not because I was trying to make up for the past, but because I was willing to be who I really am, an engineer who understands dams." Emily smiled. "You're still going to teach pottery though, right? Once we rebuild the studio?" "Of course. I love pottery. But I can do both. I can be both. I don't have to choose between the person I was and the person I became." The new pottery studio was smaller than the old one, but Carol liked it better. It had large windows looking out onto the rebuilt Main Street, and she could see her neighbors going about their lives, rebuilding, recovering, moving forward. She taught evening classes and spent mornings consulting for Morrison Hayes, reviewing dam safety reports, and sometimes traveling to inspection sites. The work was satisfying in ways she had forgotten. When she identified a potential problem in a dam in Oregon and her recommendations led to preventive repairs, she felt a deep sense of purpose. When she helped a young engineer understand the subtleties of seepage analysis, she felt her knowledge being passed on, preserved, multiplied. A year after the flood, Carol stood at the dedication ceremony for the new Willow Creek Community Center, built on high ground to serve as both a gathering place and an emergency shelter. The governor spoke. Robert Chen, now the official mayor, spoke. And then they called Carol to the podium. "I'm not much for speeches," she began, looking out at the crowd of familiar faces. "But I want to say something about second chances. 15 years ago, I came to Willow Creek running from my past, from a disaster I felt responsible for. I tried to hide who I was, what I had been. I thought that by becoming someone new, I could escape the guilt and the pain. But the flood taught me something important. You can't escape your past. It's part of who you are. The question isn't whether you have failures in your history. We all do. The question is what you do with the knowledge those failures give you. The people of Willow Creek are alive today, not because I was perfect, but because I was willing to learn from being imperfect. I was willing to act on hard-won wisdom, even when it meant facing the parts of my past I wanted to forget. As we rebuild our town, I hope we all remember that second chances aren't about forgetting who we were. They're about using everything we've learned, the good and the bad, to become who we need to be. The applause was generous, but what Carol valued more were the individual conversations afterward. Mr. Patterson, who admitted he had been wrong to dismiss her warnings. Tom Hendricks, who shared his own story of career failure and reinvention. Sarah Williams, who talked about starting the library's new collection with donated books, building something new from destruction. That evening, Carol sat in her cottage, rebuilt on the same lot as before, but with better elevation and flood protection, and looked through the engineering journals she had finally unpacked from storage. They represented decades of work, of learning, of professional growth she had tried to discard. Her laptop chimed with an email from Richard Foster. He was working for a different agency now, focusing on climate adaptation for aging water infrastructure. His message was brief. Dr. Jensen, I'm consulting on a dam rehabilitation project and could use your expertise on seepage control measures. Would you have time for a call next week? Carol smiled and typed her reply. I'd be happy to help. Outside her window, she could see lights coming on in neighbors' houses, life returning to normal rhythms, a town healing. Tomorrow she would teach a pottery class in the morning and review a dam safety report in the afternoon. She would be both the artist and the engineer, the quiet pottery teacher and the expert consultant, the woman who ran away and the woman who came back. She would be herself, complete, complicated, flawed, and finally, after so many years, at peace with all of it. 5 years later. Carol Jensen celebrated her 72nd birthday with a quiet dinner at Emily's house, surrounded by friends who had become family. Emily's children, now teenagers, presented her with a pottery bowl they had made in her class, slightly lopsided but earnest and beautiful. It's perfect, Carol said, meaning it. Later, as she drove home through the rebuilt Willow Creek, she marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The town was smaller now, about 1,500 people instead of 2,000, but it was vibrant and resilient. New buildings mixed with carefully restored historic structures. The creek ran through reinforced channels designed to handle future floods. And on the hill where Lake Serenity Dam had once stood, there was now a memorial park with a plaque honoring the evacuation that had saved so many lives. Carol's role in that salvation was acknowledged but not exaggerated. She was part of the town's story now, woven into its fabric not as a hero, but as a neighbor who had used her knowledge when it mattered most. Her consulting work had expanded beyond dam safety to include mentoring programs for young engineers, teaching courses on professional ethics and decision-making under uncertainty, and serving on advisory boards for infrastructure safety. Morrison Hayes had promoted her to senior consulting engineer, a title she wore with pride earned through hard experience. But she still taught pottery 3 evenings a week, still created bowls and vases and decorative pieces that graced homes throughout the region. Her students ranged from teenagers to retirees, all learning that clay could be shaped with patience and care into something both useful and beautiful. Last month, she had received a letter from the family of one of the workers who died at Cedar Valley Dam. They had learned of her role in saving Willow Creek and wanted to thank her. The letter had made her cry, not from guilt this time, but from a complex mixture of sorrow and gratitude and relief. "We know you've carried the weight of that day for many years," the letter said. "We want you to know that we never blamed you. We've been following your work, your consultations, your teaching. You've helped make dams safer across the country. You've shared your knowledge so that other families might be spared what we experienced. That's the greatest honor you could give to our father's memory." Carol had framed the letter and hung it in her studio, a reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about learning from it and moving forward. Tonight, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and the slightly lopsided birthday bowl filled with fresh fruit, Carol thought about the long path that had brought her here. From the heights of professional success to the depths of guilt and failure. From hiding in a small town to standing in front of that town and telling the truth. From running from her identity to embracing all of who she was. She was an engineer. She was an artist. She was a teacher and a student, a consultant and a friend, a person who had failed and a person who had succeeded. She was 72 years old, and she was still learning, still growing, still becoming. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emily. Mom wants to know if you'll teach her your advanced glazing technique next week. She's determined to master it before she turns 70. Carol smiled and typed back, "Tell her it's never too late to learn something new. I should know." She finished her tea, washed the bowl carefully, and set it on the shelf where she kept the pieces that mattered most. Gifts from students, experiments that had taught her something important, works that reminded her of specific moments in her journey. Tomorrow, she would review a safety assessment for a dam in Colorado. In the evening, she would teach her intermediate pottery class, guiding hands on wet clay, showing students how to center themselves and their work, how to shape something strong and beautiful from raw material. It was a good life. Not the life she had planned when she first came to Willow Creek, hiding from her past and hoping for anonymity. Not the life she had lived in her high-pressure engineering career before Cedar Valley changed everything. But a life that integrated all of her experiences, all of her knowledge, all of her failures and successes into something whole. Carol turned off the kitchen light and walked to her bedroom, pausing to look at the photographs on the wall. Her engineering team at Morrison Hayes from decades ago. The ribbon cutting at her first pottery studio. The evacuation of Willow Creek, captured by a news photographer. Emily and her family at last year's summer festival. Richard Foster and her other consulting colleagues at a dam safety conference. Each photograph represented a different part of who she was. Together, they told the story of a life that had been broken and rebuilt, stronger and more resilient than before. She climbed into bed and turned off the light, listening to the familiar sounds of her town settling into night. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the creek flowing past in its reinforced channel, water finding its path as it always did, persistent and powerful and beautiful. Carol closed her eyes and slept peacefully, free from the nightmares that had haunted her for so many years, held safely by the community she had saved and the knowledge that she had finally found her way home, not to a place, but to herself. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.